Okay, in this lecture we're going to take a look at tropical forests. Why are they important in today's world? And really what I want to do is to take a look at a list of all the different stakeholders in tropical forests who rely on them to a greater or lesser degree for their lives. So I want to talk about, well, first of all, the inherent biological importance of tropical rainforests, why they are so important to different people. Then I wanted to look at a list of the different stakeholders. First of all, we'll take a look at the local stakeholders. First of all, we'll look at the forest dwelling peoples, and then the edge and people who use the forest indirectly. We'll take a look at the governments of tropical countries, because they quite often have a very large say in how tropical rainforests are used and developed or retained or deforested. And finally, we'll take a look at global stakeholders, people who have a stake in tropical rainforests but don't actually live in a tropical rainforest country, but are still interested in the conservation or the use and management of tropical rainforests. So, first of all, let's take a look at the inherent biological importance of tropical rainforests. Biotic characteristics, highest diversity ecosystem on the planet. I think we've been through all that sort of thing. It's a huge standing biomass. We probably haven't looked at that. Having a huge standing biomass means that tropical rainforests store a massive amount of carbon. Now, as we know these days, that if that carbon was released into the atmosphere, it would seriously upset the heat balance of the Earth and cause global warming through the greenhouse effect. So, having all that tropical forest standing there with all the carbon locked up in a form which is not causing global warming is an enormous positive, and it's something which affects not only the people living in tropical forests, but the people all over the world. Another important characteristic of tropical forests is a large number of complex biotic interactions, which will lead to various properties such as large numbers of secondary compounds, large numbers of fruits, significant numbers of flowers and perfumes and so on. So basically these large number of complex biotic interactions quite often lead to properties of a rainforest which can be commercialized and be used by people. So large number of complex biotic interactions is an inherent biological importance in a tropical rainforest. Some people have also stated or implied that tropical rainforests are a very important powerhouse of evolution. Because of all these complex biotic interactions, there is a lot of selective pressure going on, very rapid generation times, therefore evolution, it is thought, may be proceeding very rapidly in tropical rainforests compared to other parts of the world. So these are the different biological attributes of tropical rainforests, or characteristics, which are very important for people on Earth. Another one which I probably should mention, because it is of importance to a big stakeholder, and that's the conservationists, is the huge biodiversity. Emphasize that. Because there's a huge amount of biodiversity, it's really the target for a lot of conservation, particularly because the majority of the extinction of species on Earth is occurring in tropical rainforests. But let's take a closer look at some of the stakeholders of tropical rainforests, people who have a vested interest in tropical rainforests and want to try and have a say in managing them. The first are the hunter and gatherer societies. We'll go from the most simple up to more complex. We'll go to the people who depend the most, 100% of their time, on a tropical rainforest, right up to people who do not have any direct contact with tropical rainforests and don't even live in a tropical country. But the people who are most engaged and most reliant on a tropical forest are the hunter and gatherers. These are people who wander through the bush, gathering plant materials to eat and hunting animals to eat. This is probably one of the first human societies to utilize a tropical rainforest in Africa and in other parts of the world, Southeast Asia, and in the neotropics as well. When people first arrived, they probably arrived as hunter and gatherer societies, and these people went into the rainforest. They didn't really have a huge impact. No, I shouldn't say that. It is not really known what the magnitude of the impact these hunters and gatherers had on a tropical rainforest around the world, but it is likely they caused the extinction of some animals, probably the megafauna, the large, easily hunted animals. But generally the extent of the rainforest they did not alter to any great extent, although even that is under some speculation because for instance the grand savannas in northern South America are likely to have been exacerbated or even created by human generated fires. So even hunter and gatherer societies may have had a big impact on tropical rainforests. The hunter and gatherer societies which exist in the tropical rainforests around the world today, and there aren't too many of them anymore, they do contain a great cultural and language diversity. They usually are the first human society, so they've been there for a long time, and that great amount of time has allowed them to develop great cultural and language traditions and diversities. In places like Papua New Guinea, which is covered in tropical rainforest, the essentially hunter and gatherer societies, although they do have some shifting cultivation practices, they have the greatest number of languages in the world and cultures in the world. These hunter and gatherer societies are totally dependent on tropical rainforests, and so they tend to be disappearing as rainforests disappear and are degraded around the world. They're not a huge percentage of the world's population, and even in the countries where they live, apart from maybe Papua New Guinea, and even in Papua New Guinea these days, they are quite often disregarded by all the other stakeholders, and particularly people who are in the cash economy. You see, these hunters and gatherer societies tend to live outside of the cash economy, so they have no money. So because they have no money, they have no political clout whatsoever, so they are quite often ignored when decisions come to be made for managing tropical forests. Many hunter and gatherer societies have a certain number of practices which can be classed as shifting cultivation. Now, shifting cultivation is clearing a small patch of forest, usually no more than a hectare in size, because that's the largest size which can be managed with the low technology which is available to hunter and gatherer societies. And these slashed areas are burnt and a short crop is planted. That crop may be harvested and then planted again and so on for a couple of years until the point is reached where the crops decline in yield as the nutrients which are specific to those crops are lost, and the weeds become too much for the shifting cultivator to manage, and so people will shift to another plot and repeat the process. There are some societies where they rely 100% on shifting cultivation, but more likely it is a mixture of hunter and gatherer type societies where they will utilize resources from the forest, particularly in terms of hunting and so on, and they will also utilize resources from small gardens which they will create in and around semi-permanent settlements. At the other end of the spectrum, shifting cultivation may grade into intensive agriculture, and that's agriculture which uses a lot of inputs, fertilizers and so on, to overcome the lack of nutrients in the soil after a while, and so allow people to farm the same piece of land continuously. Now, a large number of people in tropical countries practice shifting cultivation, and even though they don't live directly in the forest, they may utilize the forest to a fairly large extent, but they are also quite often, if not on the fringes, they are quite often in the cash economy, so they do have some sort of money and they do have some sort of political clout in a tropical country. If these societies increase in size, increased population densities will often lead to sustainability problems, because shifting cultivation requires a certain amount of area to feed a certain number of people. If that number of people increases, the amount of land which is needed also increases. If it increases above a certain level, then you simply cannot reach enough land to feed that population, and so the transition into intensive agriculture occurs. In the past, what it would mean is that the society or the population would have to split in two or reduce its numbers somehow to cope with it. But now, with the availability of fertilizers and herbicides and so on, intensive agriculture may result. The next set of stakeholders are quite important, and actually the society in Trinidad would probably fit into this category. These stakeholders live in a tropical country, but they live outside the rainforest. But they use tropical rainforests for goods and services. So the shifting cultivators may grade into these forest margin societies. They will quite often use these rainforests for firewood, wild meat. They will quite often use these rainforests in catchment areas to clean and control their water and to prevent erosion. Pollination services are often attributed to insect populations in tropical rainforests as well. Firewood and wild meat are by far the largest commodities which these forest margin societies will gain from a tropical rainforest. So these forest margin societies are very firmly in the cash economy, and they quite often form the largest group of local stakeholders, or stakeholders living in the tropical country. So quite often they will have a big influence on the say of tropical country governments. Now, tropical country governments will control the majority of tropical rainforests around the world. Most rainforests, most tropical forests are not privately owned. They tend to be more government owned. Privately owned tropical forests are quite often cleared and turned to some other more economic use, or where you can get a greater economic return. So most privately owned land is usually improved in some way so that the owner can get an economic return. Publicly owned forests, on the other hand, tend to be used by a diversity of people, and so the governments must try and cater for all of their needs. Because they're catering for all of their needs, quite often leaving it under forest cover is the most socially responsible thing to do. However, these tropical country governments are pulled in the direction of needing to get as much economic return from the resources of their country as possible. And governments will get their return mainly based on taxes, their tax base. And to increase the tax base, which is needed to support services such as health, education, law enforcement and so on, the government needs to have a fairly large tax base. To do this, they need to get an economic return on all of their resources, and that includes tropical forests. I think I talked about this in the last lecture, and that tends to be what drives the unsustainable use of tropical forests. So these tropical country governments will try and get some economic use out of these rainforests. Now, if we think back, we do have other users of tropical rainforests, like the hunters and gatherers, but because the hunters and gatherers are not in the cash economy, and quite often their land tenure system is very hazy and not really well recognized by people outside of their own societies, they tend to be ignored or trampled over when tropical country governments decide on things to do with the tropical rainforest. Usually the things to do with the tropical rainforest involves clearing them and converting them to some other use once the timber production is eliminated from that tropical forest. The first use of a tropical forest is timber production, but firewood extraction is also a very important use in many parts of the tropics where fuel is very expensive and difficult to come by. So timber production earns the most from a tropical forest for these governments, but unfortunately, if timber production is not managed correctly, it's only a short-term proposition, and the timber tends to be mined from the tropical forest so that it is exhausted before too long, and the forest then becomes useless for timber production. And when that happens, the tropical country governments will quite often try and switch the land to some other use. But timber production is the fifth largest non-oil and gas contributor to many developing nation economies, tropical that is. 3 to 6% of GDP in Malaysia and India came from timber production. The potential for governments to extract an economic return from timber production is much higher and also much more sustainable, as has been scientifically proved, but because of problems in setting and collecting royalties and rents, corruption, and managing the tropical forests, it becomes very difficult for these tropical country governments to get the full return from timber production. Quite often what happens is the timber is exhausted from the tropical forest, and then the tropical forest essentially becomes useless, so it is then converted to a non-forest ecosystem. And this is often preferred because it gives a higher income. It also provides employment and land for people in the country, making them happy, which means they're much more likely to keep the politician in power. So today the overall rate of primary forest lost per year is around 2% of the remaining tropical forest in the world today. So there's almost a political will to clear tropical forests because it benefits so many more people in a tropical country society. So this is often encouraged by previous users, particularly timber production, which opens it up and devalues it, and conversion to non-forest is certainly not always the end result of logging and so on, but it quite often does happen. Loss of rainforest services is also a problem for tropical country governments once they convert tropical rainforests. Erosion can become a problem. Wild meat provision and firewood provision can become a problem. You can just look at Haiti and see the big problems they have there, where all of their rainforest has essentially been lost. What tropical forest remains in these tropical countries is often degraded through the uses, and so secondary forest cover has increased dramatically. Alright, so tropical country governments will tend to try and convert tropical forests so that they can get the maximum economic return out of them, so they can also build the economy, make it larger so they get a larger tax return, so they can provide services to the people such as health, education, law enforcement, military, and so on. If the economy stays small, there will be a small tax base, and the country will not be able to afford to provide all those services. A country like Trinidad is extremely lucky having its oil and gas. That gives it a very large amount of money to build infrastructure and to so increase the amount of money that it brings in tax, because the economy is larger, and therefore the standards of health and education in this country, I can't really say law enforcement, is much greater than in other small island states in the region, and that's purely down to the oil. Once the oil runs out, there will still be a fairly large tax base, so Trinidad will be able to survive, at least for a while, until it needs to change. Hang on a minute. Okay, sorry about that. So tropical country governments grow the economy. Trinidad is lucky with the oil, and because of that, Trinidad probably has the greatest amount of natural forest left of all the Caribbean islands. It simply hasn't needed to destroy those tropical forests to try and increase its economy and therefore tax base. Alright, let's move on now to other people with other interests in tropical forests. Let's talk about people who don't actually live in tropical countries but still have an interest in tropical forests. And the first one I want to talk about are the private companies. These multinational companies will utilize tropical forests for various things. The ones that you probably think of first of all are the timber production companies. They're often focused very much on short-term profits and do not use the resource sustainably. Because they don't live in the country, because they have no interest in contributing to the economy of the country, they will only do so when they are made to do so. So they will try and dodge the taxes imposed upon them and the royalties imposed upon them by the tropical country governments. And they will have various schemes to do this. One of them is transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is when a private company harvests the timber in the tropical country. It sells that timber while it's still in the tropical country to some paper company in the Bahamas or Bermuda or somewhere like that at a very low price. But that company, that shelf company, that paper company is actually owned by the timber production company, and the timber production company can quite legitimately say, well, this is all we got for the timber, so we only owe you this much. Once the timber is shipped out of the tropical country, the paper company will sell the timber to the real market, which is quite often in the one of the developed world, the United States or Europe or Japan, and the timber won't even reach Bermuda or the Bahamas or whatever. It will be changed en route to its real destination, which is a developed country, and the price that the developed country will pay for the timber is substantially higher, 2 to 3 times the price that the shelf company paid for the timber to the timber company itself. So in that way, the timber production companies, and it is a rort, it is corruption, they dodge paying the full royalties on the timber which they take from these tropical country governments. This transfer pricing scheme is known to most tropical country governments now, so they do try to guard against it, but it is quite difficult. And Bermuda still remains one of the largest exporters of tropical timber in the world, strangely enough, when it doesn't have any forests. So timber companies will also use the tropical forests unsustainably by corrupting individuals within the tropical country. So certain governments or members within the governments will be offered bribes and so on to turn a blind eye to these timber companies maximizing their profits by taking everything out of the forest, opening up the canopy, and generally destroying the forest for future timber production in the near future, and totally devaluing the forest, so that that forest becomes essentially worthless and therefore open to conversion to non-forest use. Timber companies are only one of the type of private companies which use tropical forests. You also have bioprospecting companies. These companies are attracted by the huge amount of secondary compounds in tropical forests, and they will go into a tropical forest and they will collect as many species as they can, as long as they can identify them. So they need the fruits and the flowers, or the male and the female of animals, and so on. And they will take them back to their labs and they will carry out broad-scale screening of those plants and animals which they collect, to see whether there are any biotically active compounds in them. Once they do, they will further refine them, identify the molecule if they can, and produce the drugs out of what they find. Many different drugs are found this way. Another type of company which did start to become important, but is much less so now that the oil price has fallen, carbon brokerage companies. Now these guys would buy up rights to large areas of forest, or areas of forest. They would say, I will pay you a certain amount of money per year if you keep this area as a forest and don't chop it down. And then they would go to a developed country firm and they would say, okay, I have this forest here which is going to remain forest, okay, if we continue to pay these people this amount of money. So in your economic activity in your country, it may be a car hire firm, it may be a airline, you are producing carbon and putting it into the atmosphere. If you pay these people through me to keep their forests, you will offset the carbon that you emit during your economic activity, and you will give money to these people to allow them to maintain the forest in its natural state. These carbon brokerage companies are going to become more important in the future. Just now they're less important, mainly because people tend to be less worried about energy prices and global warming. But global warming is going to really impact on people, so the reduction of carbon into the atmosphere is going to become very important. Ecotourism operators, quite often based outside of tropical countries, they will sell trips or tourism into these tropical countries and make a return out of it. So they have a vested interest in tropical forests being there for their customers to visit. So there are global private companies in multinationals who benefit from tropical rainforests, and they would like to have a say in how they are managed. These timber production companies have gotten together and formed a pressure group, a organization which is a non-governmental organization, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and that is the ITTO, that is the International Tropical Timber Organization. But before I get on to the non-governmental organizations, I want to talk about the intergovernmental organizations. Now these organizations are formed to be either production-oriented or conservation-oriented, but their main goal is to try and achieve a perceived positive for global society. So what happens is a set of different governments around the world all get together and they contribute money to these organizations on the understanding that these organizations will try and promote things which these non-tropical governments, like the developed country governments, want and perceive to be their best interests. So some of these intergovernmental organizations are the World Trade Organization, United Nations Development Program, United Nations Environment Program, the World Bank, the Food and Agriculture Organization. These organizations are intergovernmental. They belong to no country, but they are contributed to by many countries. It's usually the developed countries which provide most of the money for these types of organizations, so they tend to impose most of their goals on these intergovernmental organizations. So things like conservation and sustainable use, which are perceived as good things in developed countries, are quite often the goals of these intergovernmental organizations. The WTO can be also used to manipulate trade between tropical countries and developed countries. Right, let's move on now to the international environmental non-governmental organizations. Well, they're not all environmental. Some of them are very production oriented, but a lot of them are conservation oriented, and these again are trying to achieve a perceived positive for global society. Some of these types of governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, are Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, the Sierra Club, and those are conservation organizations, much like IUCN, World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy. They are all conservation oriented. Other organizations like the ITTO is much more production oriented. This is the International Tropical Timber Organization. So you would have these organizations which are formed by people who are interested in either conservation or some sort of production. The ITTO is supported by timber companies, multinational timber companies. All these other organizations tend to be supported by donations from the general public and philanthropy. These non-governmental organizations also try to impose developed country goals onto tropical country governments and societies, particularly the conservation-oriented organizations. They will try and make tropical country governments and societies retain their tropical forests for conservation reasons. Alright, and the final global stakeholders that I want to talk about, actually I want to go back a bit. Let me get to the intergovernmental organizations once again. The UNDP, I believe it is, it has a very important program regarding tropical forests, and that is the Reduced Emissions from Development and Deforestation initiative, and that is where countries are paid directly from the UNDP to keep their tropical forests intact, again for carbon sequestration purposes. So the UNDP can also act very directly to impose a management on a tropical forest. Alright, so the last global stakeholders that I want to talk about are you and I. Global properties of rainforests affect you and I, and in tropical countries we can directly influence our government. Other countries must influence their government indirectly through these non-governmental or governmental organizations. You and I may have our interests directly represented by indirectly represented by intergovernmental and NGOs, as I said. We can also act directly by selectively purchasing. If we do our research and we find the products which are sustainably harvested from a tropical rainforest, we can act directly to obtain outcomes that we want by only purchasing things which are sustainably produced. We can influence or we can support proxies by lobbying and donating funds for this to happen. So we can influence directly the use of tropical forests even as consumers in a developed country. And Trinidad is a developed country whether you like it or not. Alright, so those are the global stakeholders. They are the ones which are driving the management of tropical forests. So how are they doing? Well, tropical forest status, tropical forest area plus past, present and rates of change. The past area was about 21 million square kilometers after the last glacial period. At the end of the 1990s, about 10.9 million square kilometers remained. That's about 50%. 60% was undisturbed by timber extraction and agriculture, and that is rapidly reducing. Rates of change were difficult to determine accurately because satellite imagery, which was the main way of determining, is pretty good at determining gross change from forest to non-forest, but it is notoriously difficult to determine degradation from satellite imagery. So rates of change are very difficult to determine accurately. Objective estimates say about 170,000 square kilometers per year are being converted from tropical forest to non-forest. So that's a huge amount of land. That's probably about 4 or 5 Trinidads every year being converted to non-forest land. So tropical forest is still being lost at an alarming rate. And with that, the next part of these lectures are pitched to try and present some ways in which tropical forests can be managed to minimize that impact, or try and explain how tropical forests can be managed in different ways to achieve different objectives. Okay, thank you very much.